I would like to say that I am very pleased to be here today, particularly with two of the principals of our story. And I should share with you something that comes from my wife. When I told her that I was going to be on this book tour, she gave me a really good piece of advice. Joelle said, don't try to come off being super knowledgeable, intellectual, and sophisticated. Just be yourself. So on that basis, I will be myself, and what I'd like to do is very briefly tell you about the book, and I mean briefly, and then turn it over to Mary Dunham-Nichols, who in fact is one of the principals in the book and a heroine in her own right, and Carlos C. Campbell, who flew the missions, who was an intelligence officer in the Navy, and who's got a lot of first-hand experience in this situation. And Carlos, in fact, has been jumped by MiGs several times. But that's getting ahead of the story. This book grew out of another book called Deep Black, Space Espionage and National Security, which I researched in the mid-1980s. And during the course of researching the book, and it was about spy satellites, reconnaissance satellites, I learned that Francis Gary Powers, a brave and wonderful individual, was the tip of the iceberg. In fact, more than 130 Americans died or were made prisoner during the Cold War flying reconnaissance missions against the USSR and Communist China, North Korea, and Vietnam, and the Eastern European bloc. And this is a story that basically had not been told. It was classified top secret throughout. Many of the wives did not know, in fact, most of the wives had no clue exactly what their husbands were doing, and wound up, in terms of the people who were missing, getting telegrams saying, we regret to inform you, in the case of a woman named Jean O'Kelly, whose husband died in '53, we regret to inform you that your husband is reported missing on a routine training flight near Japan. Well, A, it wasn't near Japan, it was in Vladivostok Harbor ferreting radar, and B, it was anything but a routine training flight. So there was a lot of pain, there was a lot of suffering, and what I came to find out doing the research, there were questions that weren't being answered by the government. And a curious anomaly developed. I've been a lifelong airplane buff, going back to high school. I never knew a Ford from a Chevy, but I knew every airplane that had ever been made. And I knew when I read in the paper that such and such an RB-29, a reconnaissance airplane that was missing near the Soviet Union, probably had run into trouble, but one could never prove it until recently. But that, in fact, is what was going on. The anomaly was, I would go to the movies during the Cold War, and I would see these wonderful movies about the fighter and the bomber people. I remember Strategic Air Command with Jimmy Stewart. His adoring wife was played by June Allison. I remember the McConnell story about James McConnell, our original top-scoring Korean War ace, whose adoring wife was played by June Allison. Typecast, if ever an actress was. But these people got a lot of credit, they got a lot of the glory, and in fact, during the Cold War, what they did was practice. LeMay's Strategic Air Command practiced bombing targets behind the Iron Curtain, and the fighter people in the Air Force, for example, had their exercises every year, and they got trophies. William Tell was one, Red Flag was another, and so on. I was astounded to find out that the people who were actually getting killed were the reconnaissance intelligence people, and they worked under absolute secrecy and could not in any way reveal what they were doing. And I resolved that I wanted to try to rectify that. And to rectify the fact that they were never given anywhere near the credit, no credit publicly, that they were due, and in fact were an embarrassment when they failed. And there were 16 major shoot-downs between 1950 and 1969, Air Force and Navy, and as I say, well over 100 of these guys disappeared. Some were killed, and some, without question, I have found out, were captured. And we tended to walk away from it. As somebody pointed out in the Eisenhower administration, this was a problem without a solution. If Dwight Eisenhower had gone public and said, you have Khrushchev, you have got our airmen, and the Democrats would have said, and President Wimp, what are you going to do to get them back? So the prudent thing to do was to sweep it under the rug. Don't admit you're doing reconnaissance against the Russians. You don't want to embarrass them and so on. And so it went under the rug. Now it is still under the rug. And the reason is, as somebody put it very nicely, originally it was under the rug because the Russians were our enemies, and now it's under the rug because the Russians are our friends. They need us for economic reasons. We need them for political reasons. Nobody wants to publicize the fact that the KGB and the GRU captured and brutalized American airmen during all those years. So, again, the book is a people book. The missions are in there, the planes are in there, the machinery is in there, but it's a book about human beings. And on that note, we've got two of them. I am honored to say we've got two of them here right now. One of them being Mary Dunham-Nichols, who has got her own incredible story to tell about her husband who was shot down in 1952 over the Sea of Japan. Mary?
The first thing I'd like to say is that I'm so thankful that Bill Burroughs wrote this book, because after all these years of you know, people not being interested and people not even knowing what the Cold War was, having read my story in here, I no longer feel invisible. I just, you know, all those years I felt kind of invisible, and I was even told at some point if I'd start to talk about it. At one point I said something about, this is maybe 1990, and I was going through a hard time, and I said something to a neighbor. I said, it just bubbled up. My husband's missing in action. Oh, that was 40 years ago. Forget it. Get on with your life. And this is basically the attitude with which I was treated all those years, you know. Forget it. You know, it's over with. But when my baby was six weeks old when my late husband was shot down, and he was due home in about a month. And so, and then he was due we were due to go to a permanent duty station, because he had not yet been on a permanent duty station. We were married, and 6 weeks later the Korean War started, and immediately his mission changed from being a navigator. A pilot actually started out, but he washed out. Then he got to be a navigator. But the mission changed from peacetime Air Force to wartime, and his training was speeded up. He was soon put on a combat crew, and then he shipped out in May of 1952, and his plane was shot down in October. So I was not established really anywhere, because you don't think about them dying. It's like denial. You know, they're going into danger, but it was never dealt with. In other words, there was no. We wives were not ever brought together and said, now look, you know, your husband's doing a very dangerous job, you know, and he could get killed, and what are you going to do? The point is, it was never addressed. And even after I got the news, and it had been a while later, some very lovely officers' wives came to visit me. They always make a call, but they had nothing to offer me. They had no plans or, you know, support for me or anything. And I didn't know what to ask for. I had never had a husband shot down before. So, and I would really like to see people, you know, give some thought to what happens to the military widows and fatherless children. I think that I've made some notes to help me. But anyway, my late husband, the story's in the book, so I won't say too much about it, but his remains came home, and there's nothing like a military ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. There's nothing to compare with it. And it's wonderful, and it's necessary, and it's good. However, it's merely, to me, it's merely a symbol. It's a symbol of the respect that the nation has for this man who has given his life for his country. But if that's all there is, you know, if the widows and children are just brought to the ceremony and then ignored by the military after that to fight their own way, to fight their own battles, to survive as best they can, then that beautiful ceremony is kind of meaningless to the families. Several things I'd like to see change, and one of the things that was hardest for me was being totally alone in my situation. There were other MIA widows, Air Force widows, but nobody ever put us in touch with each other. So it's unlike the men, who serve in combat or on ships and so forth, who had their annual reunions. We were never brought together. So I had no contact with another MIA widow to say, hey, what's it like for you? How do you feel? Do you feel like you're going crazy like I do? How are you planning your life? There was no one to help me, sit me down and say, he may come home, he might not come home. So what are you going to do? You've got to make some sensible plans for yourself and your child. And that didn't happen. So it was really a very, very hard time for me. Let's see. So it just seems that the widows and the fatherless children, it's as if we disappeared after the man dies. We just kind of are invisible. So at least that's how I felt. And I just had wished during those early years before I remarried, I was just wishing that there was some man I felt comfortable calling at 3 a.m. when my basement's flooding and my daughter's in bed with a fever of 103. I didn't have anybody I felt comfortable doing that with, because no one had come to me and said, now look, we're here for you, and we're here for you as long as you need us. And so that was very, very hard, struggling along alone like that. So I think, looking back on it, I think I was very, very naive. I really thought that I would get an awful lot of support after my late husband's plane was shot down. I just thought I'd get it from the military, from people, families, but people just didn't know how to handle it. I don't think it's that people didn't care, but they've just never really addressed the problem of a military death and how to handle it. Well, I think that's about all I need to say right now.
Mary, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
That was wonderful.
Thanks.
I would like to turn now to Carlos Campbell, a veteran Navy reconnaissance officer who was a navigator with VP, Patrol Squadron 22 from 1960 to 62 out of Japan, went on to become an intelligence officer with the squadron, and finally wound up in the exalted position of Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the Reagan administration. So Carlos has got a wide spectrum of achievements, and one of them being surviving being jumped by MiGs innumerable times, and I mention in the book what that's like in the pit of your stomach and the nape of your spine, and hopefully he can do a little bit of filling in on that part of history. Carlos?
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to commend Professor Burroughs for doing a fantastic job in writing a very difficult book. Let me share with the audience that a lot of my squadron mates have read the book, and they are giving him rave reviews, because all of us never expected a story like this to be told. So I really want to commend him, and I would encourage people to read the book because it's a fascinating part of history. After I completed the Naval Intelligence School, I went to Patrol Squadron 22, stationed at Barbers Point, Hawaii. And frankly, I was just living a kid's dream. I probably am still on a high when I think about my days in the Navy squadrons. And I was very lucky because I got back-to-back squadron tours, which is very unusual. We deployed to Marine Corps Air Facility in Iwakuni, Japan, which was 17 miles south of Hiroshima. We operated out of Iwakuni, we operated out of Atsugi, Japan, which is in the Tokyo metropolitan area, and also out of Misawa, Japan. This was a great time. We really were not informed about the real dangers of what we were involved with. In fact, in the spring of 19 1961, a team came over from the Pentagon, and I briefed them on all of our intercepts when we got jumped. And we showed them photographs of the Russian pilots giving us the international non-peace sign, the bird, that close to the cockpit. We described all of the tactics and tried to relive part of the experience with them. One thing that I felt kind of good about is that we never had anybody in our squadron complain about the anxiety that one would experience when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you have a couple of MiGs, not just on your tail, but off your wings. Many of them would engage in provocative actions because what they would try to do, they try to turn us toward the coast, because if we got close enough, then they basically could shoot us down or shoot us up, and that happened. But it never happened to us. It happened to squadrons that we relieved and ones that relieved us. So we were very, very fortunate. We never thought about the danger. We thought about the job that had to be done. We were in the business of getting electronic intelligence on Soviet radar. You can break a radar down so it has what are called fingerprints. You can look at the frequency, the pulse repetition frequency, bandwidth, I should say pulse repetition rate, bandwidth, and things like that. Now, why do you want that information? You want that information so if you have a war, you can effectively counter or jam the enemy's radar. So that information is extremely important to enhance your chances of completing an operational mission if you get involved with hostilities. What else did we do? We collected intelligence on Soviet submarines. During the Cold War, the Soviets tried to convince the world that they had 400 or 500 submarines. We would fly in the Sea of Japan, and we would see the Russians changing the hull numbers on the side of the submarines, because I don't know if you remember in World War II when the British built the plywood navy. So when the Germans would fly over and they take pictures of, they thought they had something that they really didn't have, or vice versa. So we would get information on Soviet submarines. We'd get information on Soviet ships. One time I happened to be out, and our crew ran smack dab in the middle of a Soviet ocean exercise. It basically was probably an ASW exercise. But we photographed Whiskey-class submarines. We were one of the first squadrons to photograph the Gulf-class submarines, which was a ballistic missile submarine. So we got quite a bit of the order of battle photographed. Typically, when we got jumped, the intercepts would not last that long. They would go anywhere from maybe 7 to 10 minutes. Keep in mind that a patrol plane that's propeller-driven is more efficient at lower altitudes, and a jet is more efficient at higher altitudes. So if we would go low, then of course we would have an advantage. Also, in the most serious incident that we had, we were jumped by a MiG out of North Korea, and they had their fire control radar on us, which means they were ready to shoot us down. But it was overcast, and we were able to go into the soup. I've always told people we went below 500 feet. We probably were 50 to 75 feet off the deck. Now, the reason that we did that is because it's very difficult for a jet flying at the speed that they would fly to pull up. And if they, impact the water, they would ruin their entire afternoon. So we basically would use that as a defense tactic. Again, I'd like you to think about government policy, the Defense Department policy, in not going after downed airmen. Now, there's some reasons which I wouldn't support, but a typical scenario might be intelligence that's really hard that says there are 9 people in a prison camp north of a place called, say, Khabarovsk in the Soviet Far East, and you do an extraction, proposal, and it says, well, it's going to cost you 50 people to get 9 out, and also you might risk war. So you have these so-called whiz kids up in the Pentagon saying, well, this doesn't make sense. I wouldn't want to be in the position to make that decision because myself, I would go for it and say, well, we're just going to have to kill more of them than we lose. And the United States will, as long as war exists, those situations are going to come up. I would encourage you to read the book because I think there's some serious policy questions that are raised, not just about the whole issue of extractions, but also about the need to continue to exercise vigilance in going against a potential enemy. Here, we have a situation now where we can use non-pilot aircraft to collect intelligence. Let me just close by saying I was very lucky after the 2 squadron tours in the Naval Postgraduate School. I got orders back to the Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters. Again, you get a lot more of the big picture. And there I couldn't say this without probably getting shot or arrested back in 1965. We used we used satellite photography. I was a chief target analyst for all of the Soviet naval installations. So words, when I went through college, I never thought I could pronounce Vladivostok, more or less look at it from the... So, places like Vladivostok and Olga Bay and Petrie and, Sevastopol and all these other places, that's what you're looking at. That was an exciting position to have because I think that the United States, from a technology standpoint, has really done an incredible job in staying ahead of the curve, notwithstanding recent glitches in the area of human intelligence. But from a technology side, I think the country's made a tremendous leap, and Professor Burroughs wrote Deep Black, which goes on to the Eland side of that out of the National Security Agency. So I'd encourage you to read this. It raises a lot of issues about policy. I think the people that did this, and I say particularly the families, the wives and the children, the anxiety that they experienced, I think puts them in the hero category and heroine category because they had to live in a situation where their fathers and their husbands couldn't share with them what they were doing. And one of the things about life is, meaning what you do is of great significance. So imagine that. So basically that's all I have to say.
It is quite a lot. What's been going through my mind right now is that this has amounted, with the two of you here, this has amounted to an oral history. And very valuable in its own sake. I would say a couple more things in closing. One is, this is the 10th book I've written, and in the course of the other 9, I have made a lot of really great acquaintances. This remains the only book I've ever written where I have made lasting friends. And for that, I am deeply grateful to you people. Finally, I would like to say that this ain't just history. It is current events. When Shane Osborne ran into, or vice versa, that authentic Chinese hot dog near Hainan Island on April 1st and had to land with his crew, that he was on one of these missions. The Navy was flying it, and it's important to note that as soon as those people were released by the Chinese, the Air Force Rivet Joint Program picked it up to show the other side that we weren't going to get chased out of there, that the reconnaissance was just as important now as it was during the Cold War. And what you're not reading coming out of Afghanistan is we're still doing it. And as an old newsman, I can't help but make the remark that when you lose 30 or 40 planes on a mission, that's news. As when a house falls down, that's news. When you don't lose any planes on a mission, that's not news. But some of us know that the reason our losses have been very light against Iraq and in Kosovo in '99 and now in Afghanistan is because the recce guys, the intelligence collectors, were there first, flying the shadow missions out of sight of the rest of the world and with no recognition at all. So they're still doing it, and a lot of lives are owed to these very brave, very quiet heroes. And I guess that's it. Thank you. Iceberg. In fact, more than 130 Americans died or were made prisoner during the Cold War flying reconnaissance missions against the USSR and Communist China, North Korea, and Vietnam, and the Eastern European bloc. And this is a story that basically had not been told. It was classified top secret throughout. Many of the wives did not know this situation. And Carlos, in fact, has been jumped by MiGs several times. But that's getting ahead of the story. This book grew out of another book called Deep Black, Space Espionage and National Security, which I researched in the mid-1980s. And during the course of researching the book, and it was about spy satellites, reconnaissance satellites, I learned that Francis Gary Powers, a brave and wonderful individual, was the tip of the iceberg. I would like to say that I am very pleased to be here today, particularly with two of the principals of our story. And I should share with you something that comes from my wife. When I told her that I was going to be on this book tour, she gave me a really good piece of advice. Joelle said, don't try to come off being super knowledgeable. In fact, most of the wives had no clue exactly what their husbands were doing, and wound up, in terms of the people who were missing, getting telegrams saying, we regret to inform you, in the case of a woman named Jean O'Kelly, whose husband died in '53, we regret to inform you that your husband is reported missing on a routine training flight near Japan. Well, A, it wasn't near Japan, it was in Vladivostok Harbor ferreting radar, and B, it was anything but a intellectual and sophisticated. Just be yourself. So on that basis, I will be myself, and what I'd like to do is very briefly tell you about the book, and I mean briefly, and then turn it over to Mary Dunham-Nichols, who in fact is one of the principals in the book and a heroine in her own right, and Carlos C. Campbell, who flew the missions, who was an intelligence officer in the Navy, and who's got a lot of first-hand experience in